Thank you so much for a very kind introduction. I'm almost shocked that you've done the readings or read stuff that I've written recently. Thank you so much for referring to that. I will be doing some advertisements about this later today, but still, thank you so much. Once again, it's a great honor to take part this morning session or this afternoon, evening session in LA. Especially it has a very special meaning for me because if you think my English is okay, it's because I was very lucky to live in South Pasadena when I was in elementary school. And it's all thanks to Miss Wells, who patiently taught me at the ESL class at Monterey Hill School in South Pasadena, California. And it's the 3.5 years that I lived there as an elementary school student, and all my wonderful friends that I made there that is really the basis of who I am right now. And I'm all very grateful to LA. I've actually taught at UCSD, UC San Diego for 2 semesters, but for some reason, LA seemed really, really, really far. And I haven't been back in LA, I guess I just realized in the past 30 years. So I do hope to visit you in LA because I've heard that many things have changed, of course, in the past 30 years. But with that, with my thanks, I really want to start with my thanks to my teachers that in LA. And so I just wanted to start there. But anyway, so today we're going to talk about US-Japan relations, and there's different ways to do this. And obviously it's not possible to cover everything in the time that we have. So I decided today to focus on the alliance relationship, or especially the security aspect of the relationship. I always encourage students to not prepare too many slides for the presentation, but I did exactly that today. So I might just skip over some while I watch the time. But I would like to start my I'd like to go use the PowerPoint presentation. But if you have any questions, please, I think this is video recorded, so I have to do my lecture first, but please feel free to start asking questions in the chat box. I'll be able to look at them and also possibly to have some discussion after the presentation part, which I hope shouldn't last all too long. So let me just start my slides right here. So I'll talk about US-Japan relations, the alliance that I mentioned, the plan of class. So I'm going to start with showing you some maps. And I always find that useful to try to get the attention of the students. So I'll do that and try to play with that. Usually I do a discussion based on the maps, and we can't do that now. But if you can start thinking about what you think when you look at the maps, that'll be great. Then I'll cover the fundamentals of Japan's security policy, because I'm going to be talking a lot about change. But there's some things that are surprisingly have not changed. So I'd like to start with that. And I'll go into the recent developments in Japan's security policy. Some of it is going to be technical, but I would like to make the facts available to you rather than commentary. So it's intentionally based on government documents and white papers, and it's somewhat dry, but I do think that getting the facts straight is very important in this day and age. So I'm going to try to do that to explain and try to highlight what's important or what's the best way to read what's there. Finally, I do think it's very important to look at public opinion on these matters, and I think that's always a good way to start a discussion too. So I bring in some public opinion results, the recent ones, and also some that actually ask the American public about what they think about the alliance. So that's the plan. But my goal, as I write in yellow here, is to provide topics and resources for discussion in classrooms. I understand this PowerPoint will be available to you, as well as the links to what I quote here. And so hopefully that will be a good starting point for your discussion. I have some other readings that I recommend that I don't necessarily quote here, but this is more about documents that I'm trying to help you decode if you are going to make them available to students. But that I will try to follow up on if there's any questions about readings that cover the entire post-war period. So that's the plan of class. And let me start with something cute, because I'm not going to talk about anything cute after this. I wonder what your students and your impression of Japan might be. I remember growing up in LA in the late 70s that people were afraid of raw fish and seaweed. So it's really hard to imagine how sushi as and below has become really, really popular. But I remember when I was teaching at Columbia University in New York, students tended to know Japan or really like the mochi ice, which I see in the middle. And there's no such thing really as mochi ice in Japan. So I was kind of surprised, as well as the ramen that cost more than $20 in Manhattan, but it doesn't really cost that much in Japan. But I guess, the cute things, the Totoro and the Pokemon might be what people might know. So what is the impression, or what do your students think about Japan? I'm really curious to know. But I think what might be a good starting point, which I don't refer to for this class, for you is a resource, this wonderful resource that is published from the East-West Center and Sasagawa's foundation that looks at U.S.-Japan relations in a more diverse point of view. I will throw in one or three pages from the security aspect, but if you'd like to talk about where Japan is and how the relationship between the two countries is, I still think that this is the most important, and it has recently been updated in 2023. It gets updated every 2 or 3 years, I understand. So I would really recommend looking at this to get started on where U.S.-Japan is. But since I'm going to focus on the alliance, I think there's an alliance aspect, a business aspect, and a cultural aspect, which I think is ABC. I'm just going to do alliance, which might be the most boring, but please bear with me because that happens to be what I do. So this is the map of the world. And I'm curious to know whether you use the one on the left or the right. The one on the left is the world, and it was the one that I saw in my son's textbook class when he was in middle school in New Jersey. And I wasn't too sure this was an East Coast thing or about it, but you can see that the US is on the left and there's the Atlantic is in the middle of the map. And if you look at this map, the map on the left, Japan and the US is extremely far on the edge of each side and doesn't really seem like they connect in any way. But the world map, this is both a National Geographic map, but that is used commonly in Japan, is the one on the right, with the Pacific Ocean at the center. And so in that sense, Japan and US are far, but it's not like on different edges of the page. So I think it really depends on which map you look at, how much distance you think might be between US and Japan. And also I think the reason why Japan is called the Far East is that it is very much far east if you look at the map on the left, but it's really not the Far East if you look at the map on the right. But just as a starting point, I think the point here is that it looks farther on the map on the left. And this shows sort of how the world was looked at with an Atlanticist kind of view. But I think if you look at it from a Pacific point of view, Japan is actually not really the Far East. And yet the Pacific Ocean is huge. And there's a big difference between Japan and the US. And the huge Pacific Ocean is something to keep in mind when I talk about the security situation in Japan. The second map is a map that is often used when you talk about security policy in Japan, especially if you are doing defense. This has been around for a while, and I've seen it posted in the Ministry of Defense headquarters. But I'd like for you to think about why this map is used in defense world. As you can see, it's an upside down view of East Asia and the Sea of Japan. And Japan is sort of the peninsula that is on the outskirts in a way. And you can see Korea to be sort of a dagger in a way, they say, towards the region. And then there's Russia to the left and China to the east. And you see Taiwan. And you also see the Okinawa Islands, which stretches really close to Taiwan. And that's the Japanese archipelago. Look at it this way, you can see sort of how wide it is in a way, from the north to the south, and how geographically close Okinawa is, and then the southern islands are to Taiwan. Also, when you look at this map and think of yourself as Russia or China, you can kind of see how Japan is in the way if they want to expand if they intend for a maritime expansion. And you can think about the role Japan played during the Cold War when the Americans were afraid of Russia or the Soviet Union, and what Japan's role could be when it comes to China, if the US is worried about China, and yet there's a huge Pacific Ocean in between Japan and the US. But I think this explains a lot of things. This has not moved, obviously, for thousands of years. And I think there's a point to be made that Japan has always lived in this neighborhood for the past, since there were people. And so Japan has always lived next to a bigger country, which is China, and that Japan has remained relatively safe and was never conquered by the continental part of Asia. And what to make of that, I think, is very interesting, and whether or not that's something that we can still take for granted. I would hope, of course, but it's just that there's something to be thought about geography as destiny as I look at here. And I think this map is sort of a fun map to play with when you think about, when you talk to your students. And I always use this as a starting point when I talk about security policy in Japan. The reason for that is that this is from the defense policy, Defense of Japan. That is the white paper on defense published by the Ministry of Defense that I will refer to often today, is that if you look at PLA, the People's Liberation Army of China's recent activities surrounding sea and airspace of Japan, these are what we've been seeing in terms of how much action there is by the Chinese military. And this is the reason why Japan is very worried. But I think from China's point of view, they might want to see how much they can expand, and this is what they're doing to see where the routes might be. But this is a source of concern, and this upside down map is used in the defense white paper, which I think is quite interesting to explain how much there has been activities in the surrounding sea area of Japan. So what to make of all this? One resource there's actually two on this page that I like to refer you to. One is there's a video program called Japan's About Face. This is from 2008. It's on the PBS website, and the full episode, as far as I understand, is still available. The site itself is not active anymore. It's not updated, but you can see the full episode in about 10-minute segments. It's cut out, but you can see the whole thing. And I have to say that I'm not suggesting that you watch this because I'm in it. It's actually despite the fact that I do appear on this show that I'm recommending it. I do hope you can just get me when you see me, but it's still a very good history of post-war Japan's development and defense field. And it's really well done in 30 minutes. Although the reason why I'm in it is not because I wanted to be in it, but because I worked with the director to make the part that was filmed in the National Defense Academy of Japan. You can see the cadets below happen. And I was working with the producer to do interviews to the cadets in the academy. But it's actually a good description of where Japan was in 2008. It is when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was assassinated, unfortunately, was doing his first term. And things have happened since then. And a lot of things have happened since this video. So in some ways, the content is not relevant anymore. But I think the rate of change in the past 15 years, you can see by watching this video and doing like a before and after question, which I'm sort of going to do already in this class. A lot of things have changed, but not necessarily in the direction that this program suggests. So I think it could be an interesting exercise. And also there's a lot of good video clips of the history of post-war development of the Japanese self-defense forces. That is done very well, as well as interviews with the then defense minister, Mr. Ishiba, who happens to be the current prime minister. Also interviews with Professor Yokibe, who is a historian of diplomatic history, who actually unfortunately recently passed away. So it's actually a really interesting video given the current times, and I do recommend that you see that. The other issue of The Economist, this was a special report in December 2021 that I strongly recommend. It is a very overarching a special edition that covers various topics on Japan. The first part of the article is called On the Front Line, Japan on the Front Line about defense. But I do think that it covers other issues that I will touch upon about Japan's demographic challenge and so forth. And this is extremely useful. And it's written by my good friend Noah Snyder, who is the East Asia Bureau Chief of The Economist. But this is something that I really recommend for its content, but also it's really good writing too. So I think altogether it'll be very good for your students. So what do I mean by the demographic challenge? I did not realize that Mr. Elon Musk will be like playing the role that he is playing right now when I prepared this slide. But he in 2022 all of a sudden tweeted, at the stated risk of stating the obvious, unless something changes to cause the birth rate to exceed the death rate, Japan will eventually cease to exist. This will be a great loss to the world. And it kind of came from out of nowhere. But the point is that it is true that the population trends in Japan are looking like the population is going to decline very rapidly, as you can see in this figure. But it's not just that it's going to decline, but if you look at the proportion of the different colors, it is not just declining, but the age distribution is changing. What I mean by that is that if you look at the PowerPoint on the figure on the left, you can see that the shape of the population pyramid has been changing, and that is to say that it used to look like a pyramid, but it looks more like, I don't know, a vase now that it's really top heavy, meaning that it's not just that we're going to have less people, but fewer young people are going to be supporting a big senior population, which I'll be part of by that time. And so it's not just the population shrinking, but we're going to have much less people in the working population, and that's going to be a long-term trend. And that's where we are, and keep that in mind as we talk about the security situation. The other part that is not as relevant possibly for the security aspect, but I think is still very interesting that I'd like to point out, is that it's not happening at an equal speed. And that is to say that there are some prefectures are like states in Japan, and areas in Japan that's going to depopulate much quicker, that is going to have a huge imbalance going forward. So there will be villages that will only have people who are very, very, very old, and that is already happening. So that, I think, is always sort of an interesting part of the story that maybe when you look at the social part, social issues in Japan, your students might be interested in. And this is in comparison with what's happening in the US and other countries, just for point of comparison. But although the US is growing in population, I do think that it is interesting to note that it's not just happening in Japan, but it's actually going to be a common issue for other countries in Asia, especially China and Korea, that the birth rate is not high there. So we're going to have the same issues there. And that demographic crisis, I think, is something that is very interesting for anybody interested in the topic of social sciences in general. But I would like to point out that the biggest concern for Japan right now is how much change there has been since even 2008, when the program Japan's About Face was filmed, in terms of Japan's DVP as relations to China's DVP. And although I think as a region, that means that the region is prosperous and the Asia as a whole is more prosperous as a result, you could see, if you put yourself in Japan's feet, it does seem to be somewhat of a change. I am showing you this figure intentionally just to show you the evolution and the change in where Japan is in China over time, that this has something about between 2008, and this is until 2018, but this difference is getting wider between Japan and China, that is feeding into people's feelings about the security situation as well. And this is also with the defense budget that Japan is more worried about China, because it's not just growing economically, but they're spending more on military. And this is another, I'm not going to decode this, but there's a lot of discrepancy, huge discrepancy between what China has and what Japan has. And it's not just China, but it's also North Korea, that if you look at the picture on the the lower right corner. This is the TV screen that you see when there is a missile test from North Korea, that there's this J alert that says take shelter. And in fact, there hasn't been one that ever landed on Japan. But I'm just going to like to point out that if you look at the top right corner, there's that many missile launches by North Korea. And every time there's one, there is this message saying there was a missile shot from North Korea that kind of blocks the TV screen. So although it never has landed in Japan, and there's some prefectures listed to cause some warning by the route of the missile, and it doesn't happen for all missile launches, only for ones that are suspected of coming towards the direction. Still, there has been a sense of threat from North Korea as becoming more real as there has been more further missile development. And more recently, it's not just that. I don't want to get into an even more dire mood, but for Japan, it's really a concern that Russia and China are doing military joint flight overs together, as you can see on the right. And also there has been more closer ties, arguably, between Russia and China. And that and North Korea and Russia seem to have some special, more closer relationship going on. And the most recent news, as you know, is that North Korean troops are fighting in Ukraine. So from Japan's point of view, do we see now of some kind of a grouping, or maybe not an alliance, but some close relationship between China, Russia, and North Korea? And if you remind yourself of the map that I showed you, that is not a friendly situation for Japan, and that is a cause for concern. So what would you do if the changes since 2008 is the way it is right now? Would you change what's called the peace constitution? I will explain what that is. And what would you do with the self-defense forces? It's still called the self-defense forces. Would you expect that to play a greater role? And what about the US? I'm not in the introduction, my piece on the election of President Trump in 2016 and his inauguration in 2017 was mentioned. That's not the topic I'll talk about today. That's a totally separate, different, important topic. But as a backdrop, I would like to you to keep in mind that that has happened, obviously, and then what impact that might become this time around. Does that make Japan feel more secure about its relationship and alliance with the US and its commitment in the region or not? And I think you can guess that probably people are more worried than not, and that's a safe assumption. So that I'll leave there. But what would you do, or what would your students do if you ask that question, if you see the changes that I just showed you in the region, and also the geographical constraints or the geopolitical reality that Japan has been facing for its long history? So the Japan's about face did not predict, or in the 2008, there was no prediction of what happened. And I would like to ask you to watch it to tell me what they got wrong. But in a way, there's a lot of things that happened after that. One, I will point out that, as you know, there was a major earthquake in 2011. And of course, that has nothing to do with the security situation per se. It's just that that was a very shocking event for Japan that would lead to its sense of vulnerability. And somebody told me just recently in a symposium that maybe Japan is not that shocked about many things, including maybe the election of Mr. Trump, because we have earthquakes and tsunamis. I don't really know that I thought that was an interesting point, but I do think that there has been worries about Japan's security in multiple ways in the past 15 years. As I wrote it, there was the rise of China's military power. And so when Prime Minister Abe returned to power in 2012, he did a couple of things which I will try to highlight. He changed he drafted a new national security strategy and also came up with a new national security secretariat then. And then but I do like to point out here about what has changed and what has not changed. That, in a way, the national security strategy of 2022, which I'll talk about, is not a complete departure from what Japan has been doing, in that there is a common misunderstanding that Japan has changed its constitution. It has not. It has changed the interpretation of the constitution. I will try to explain what that means. And we are still very much we place a huge importance on the US-Japan alliance. But in some ways, the how we look at defense policy has changed in a way that it's not just the US-Japan alliance, but it's Japan's own self-defense, Japan's US-Japan alliance, and working with other partners in the region. And so those three are the important factors. But let me just start with what I mean by the Constitution and the US-Japan alliance being the fundamental pillars of Japan's security policy. So as I said, I guess I already talked about what's written here, but the key long-standing pillars of Japan's defense policy is the US-Japan alliance and Article 9. And I'll talk about what that is, but there has been change in 2013 and 2022. And partnership with other countries, I'll try to explain what that means. So what is the Constitution of Japan, Article 9? I think you and your students must have heard about Japan having the Article 9 or the Peace Constitution, but it's true that people have not really looked at what exactly that is. So I'm introducing to you what the exact wording of Article 9 is. And I would not read it out loud, but this is what the Article 9 says. And so Japanese people forever renounce war as a sole right of the nation in order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph. Land, sea, and air, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained, and the belligerency of state will not be recognized. So Japan has not changed Article 9. And I guess I will talk about the defense buildup, and you can tell me whether you think that what the current Japan's capability that we have doesn't seem in line with the wording of the Constitution, because I think most of my students, when I teach abroad, the reaction is, hey, it doesn't really look like what it is the Article 9 and what Japan has makes sense together. But there is an explanation of why it is consistent. This is from Defense of Japan White Paper 2017, but I think the basic argument has not changed. The reason for why we can have a pacifist constitution and a quite robust military is that the Constitution does prescribes the renunciation of war, prohibition of war potential, and the right of violence to state, but does not deny Japan's inherent right of self-defense as a form for nations. So Japanese government interprets as a constitutional right to possess the minimum armed forces necessary to exercise that right. So although it might look like it doesn't really make sense to have a pacifist constitution and robust military, the understanding or the interpretation is that as long as it is within the constitutional right to possess the minimum armed forces necessary to exercise that right, it should be not a contradiction that we have the forces that we have. But I think this could be something that your students might be interested in looking at, and that I'll show you where I would provide public results if you're interested about where the Japanese public is on this and what they think about the possible or apparent discrepancy between what's written on the Constitution and what we have as a defense force. Next, what is the US-Japan alliance? There's different ways to describe the alliance. Of course, we can talk about the friendly relationship, but this is basically the bottom line of what we mean by the alliance relationship between the two countries. That we have a treaty of what's called the mutual cooperation and security, and there's two components to it. There's Article 5 and Article 6. And Article 5 says that each party, this is US and Japan, recognizes that an armed attack against either party and the territories under the administration of Japan will be dangerous to its own peace and blah, 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 blah. And that the two will meet the common danger in accordance with this constitutional provisions and processes. And 2 is that for the purpose of contributing to security of Japan and the maintenance of international peace and security in the Far East, the US is granted the use of its land, air, and naval facilities in areas of Japan. And so Article 5, in short, says that armed against either party either party, US or Japan, in the territories under the administration of Japan, the two will act to meet the common danger, but in accordance with its constitutional provisions and processes. So what does Article 5 says? It says that it does not say, well, what does Article 5 does not say? It does not say that Japan will come in the defense of the US when the US is attacked. And also it says that both countries will act in accordance with the constitutional provisions and processes. So that is Article 5, and the Article 6 is for that. Japan and the US is granted the use of land, air, and naval and facilities areas in Japan. And if you show that to your students, or if I show that to my students, the question is, so what is the mutuality of the relationship? So it is a cooperation, initially it was said, between goods and people, or that's how scholars talked about that. That is basically an exchange for basis for protection, since Japan is not obligated to come to defense of the US. In some ways, it's asymmetrical. And for that reason, Japan provides a basis. So it's basis for protection. The shortcoming or the problem or the difficulty is that over the years, the US bases that are in Japan has been more heavily concentrated in Okinawa. 70% of US bases is concentrated in Okinawa. Is that okay? And I will talk about how there's a geographic necessity to that, but that was considered a problem when you think about the burden that is on the Japanese people. And in some ways, the Japanese public, unless you're living in Okinawa, did not really see US forces or this side of the defense cooperation on day-to-day basis. But that has been changing over the years, that it's not just people and bases anymore, that there has been more that the Self-Defense Force has done to contribute to the alliance itself within the alliance partnership. Although the treaty has not changed and the constitution has not changed, so there's a limit to what the Self-Defense Force can do, there has been a reinterpretation of the constitution to allow for limited collective self-defense, which is a really difficult thing to say. It's almost a tongue twister. But what happened is that the Constitution's interpretation has been changed, allow for limited collective self-defense in special circumstances. And I'm going to explain the technical reinterpretation, and bear with me because it's really technical, but I think this is very crucial, that Japan has not changed the constitution, but made it possible for Japan to do more within its alliance relationship, so that it would not be just exchange of basis for protection, but that will be more of a treaty relationship or alliance where Japan does step up when necessary. And what do I mean by that? This is from the Sasagawa pamphlet that I mentioned that you might want to look at. Let me just skip. So let me just backtrack. So Japan's basic policy for Japan's national defense was actually consistent from 1957 to 2016. But it changed in 2013 to allow for more, to strengthen the deterrence and to improve the security environment of the region and to improve the global security environment. That is, in short, saying that they feel that the security environment has changed enough that there needs to be change to the national security strategy and for Japan to be able to do more for its own defense. And so it called for strengthening and expanding Japan's capabilities and roles, strengthening the US-Japan alliance, and strengthening diplomacy and security cooperation with its partners in the region. And these three actually stay until today. But what exactly was done to expand Japan's capabilities and roles? So there was a legislation called Legislation for Peace and Security that passed after a major controversy within the Japanese Diet. And in the legislation for peace and security, I think I skipped a slide. I will change that later. But there has been a change in the interpretation of the Constitution to allow for what's called a limited collective self-defense. That is, that U.S. force is allowed when an armed attack about Japan occurs, but not just that, or when an armed attack against a foreign country that is in a close relationship with Japan occurs, and as a result threatens Japan's survival and poses a clear danger to fundamentally overturn people's right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that part is what changed. And what is this to say? This means that Japan will be able to act when or U.S. use of force is allowed for when alarm attack against Japan occurs, but not just that, but also when armed attack against a foreign country that is in a foreign relationship with Japan occurs. Note that this basically means the U.S., but not necessarily, and that the attack threatens Japan's survival and poses a clear danger. So it's not when there's a direct armed attack about Japan that occurs, but when what is a situation that is deemed to be threatening Japan's survival occurs, that Japan is able to use force. And that has been the change that was made to expand what Japan can do in a U.S.-Japan alliance relationship and for Japan to become more secure as a result. And so what are the situations under which Japan's survival is threatened? Because that, I think, is, for some who criticize this legislation, this is a very slippery term that you can define it as basically anything. But for those who are still calling for more expansion of what Japan can do, this could be too limited. And this is the exact wording of what is said to explain what are the situations under which Japan's survival is threatened. And this is also something that I come back to when I show you the opinion polls about what Japanese public thinks, what situations under Japan's survival is threatened means. And this is what is a foreign country that is in a close relationship and poses a clear danger are the two terminologies that are key. Also, there are those situations that is called the situations with important influence in Japan's peace and security. The self-defense force is able to provide necessary logistic support and search and rescue to armed forces in foreign countries, not just the U.S. And that is another change that came about with the security legislation. So what is important to note here is that with the legislation, what Japan can do within the Constitution has expanded, and that Japan can contribute more to the U.S.-Japan alliance, so the alliance relationship is not just basis for protection. So there are room for Japan to step up when there is a contingency in a region, which of course diplomatically Japan will try to avoid, but still it is something, there's an awareness that the situation is getting enough dire enough that things might change, and also that now that was done in 2015, so that's prior to the Trump administration. But I think there is a sense that maybe U.S. commitment in the region might change over the years, and for that reason too, Japan needs to make sure that the U.S.-Japan alliance is sound, and so to try to show that Japan can actually step up, as I mentioned in the Trump piece in Foreign Affairs piece in 2017. So that was where things were in 2015. But as I say, in 2022, I argue that it was an unexpected year of change, that I think people would be surprised to think, in hindsight, that war in Ukraine was what was catalyst for change in many ways in Japan. That although there has been changes in the legislation, Japan has been spending more on defense, still it wasn't at the pace of what we see today as of 2022. But for some reason, and I hate to advertise, but I do hope that you'll read my article in Foreign Affairs, that there has been changes in Japanese public opinion and Japanese changes in Japan's defense policy, although I would like to underline that the legislative basis have not changed. So what I explained just now about 2015 is still relevant, but still in terms of defense spending and where the public is on defense issues, there has been major change in the past 2 years, I would say. And I think there's two words that are repeated a lot when we explain the change that I'd like to emphasize here. One is that I'm not sure how much impact this quote had in the US, but there was a lot of attention, especially among the security experts, that the President Joe Biden said, American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves. And I think that's just when people realized that maybe this might be the case for the U.S.-Japan alliance too, that this might be something that Japan needs to think of itself as Afghan forces in a way. The second quote that was mentioned a lot after this Biden quote is, "The world only helps those who help themselves." And I think this is a reflection of what was happening in Ukraine, that there was something about Ukrainians fighting for its not just territory, but democracy that was in many ways inspiring for the Japanese people. And there was a sense that the international support for Ukraine had something to do with the fact that the Ukrainians themselves were fighting. So the Afghan withdrawal by the US meant a lot, not just for Japan in terms of the fact that the US might withdraw, but more in terms of what Japan can do to make sure that US does not withdraw. And also what happened in Ukraine was a reminder, first and foremost, that wars still occur in ways that we never expect, that there could be an invasion by a country into the territory in a country that seems more or less like any developed country. Some argue that it is somewhat of hypocritical behavior, that people worried more about Ukraine than all the wars that happened in Africa, other places, but still there was something about the visual images of what was happening in Ukraine that had a major impact in Japan. So it was in many ways a turning point for public opinion, and that's what I argue in this article that I wrote in 2022. And I'm happy, I don't know if I should say happy, but I am rather surprised that it turned out the way that I said, and that the subtitle, Tokyo Moves Towards a More Assertive Security Policy, is not one that I chose. I thought it was a little too forthcoming, and that's what the foreign affairs editors chose. But I think that in the end, I could say that I was right by saying that Tokyo did move to a more assertive security policy. If you're interested in the security policy change, I'm here to introduce different sources for you. There was a really important document analysis special feature in the Institute of Geoeconomics that did, and there's a lot of content there. So I'm going to point you to that to explain what it is. But let me explain what the defense new national security policy is as of 2022. One, this is just a visual expression, but Japan decided to spend more, which is that we are expanding our defense spending to 2% of the GDP. The 2% might sound familiar to you. That is what President Trump demanded of NATO countries back when he was in government. And that, but Japan thought there's just no way that Japan will spend up to 2%. And fortunately, maybe for Japan, Mr. Trump did not demand that directly back then, or to threaten retaliation if Japan didn't. But in many ways, due to unexpected reasons. One, of course, is the rise of the tensions in the region and the buildup of Chinese military capability in the region. But not just that, but as a catalyst for change, I would argue, the war in Ukraine did help in a way of making people more worried about Japan's own defense capabilities and had the public opinion to be more permissive to the possibility of spending more on defense. This is not going to happen overnight. It is going to take place until 2027. And in the course of 5 years from 2022, Japan has committed to increasing its defense spending to about 2% of the GDP. But there's a lot of uncertainty about whether, I shouldn't say a lot of, there's some uncertainty about how exactly they accomplish that. But at least I would say that that pledge was made and it went without that much public outcry, which I think is quite interesting. Also, it's not just the volume, but in terms of the quality of what we're buying, we are introducing what's called the counter-strike capabilities. And there was a Q&A, this is from the defense white paper, about how can you have a counter-strike capability, which is to be able to strike a different country in a long distance. How can that be not violate the Constitution? And this is the answer provided by the Minister of Defense, that it is a minimum measure for self-defense against attacks in Japan by ballistic missiles or other means. So it falls within the purview of the Constitution and the international law, and adhere to Japan's exclusive defense-oriented policy. But some critics will argue that the discrepancy between the Constitution and what Japan possesses have just expanded due to the possession of the counter-strike capability. And this is the major expenditures in the next 5 years. The other is that there has been more straightening of US-Japan alliance, but I think it's fair to say that it has been more about the Japan's building its own defense that promised that has been more significant in the recent 3-4 years. And we'll see how the US-Japan alliance part will change over the years. And the new part, I would say, is working with other partners in the region. I'll show you some slides again, but this is the government description of what the new concept, what is called the free and open Indo-Pacific is. This is not new to be, to correct myself. It was introduced, its predecessor was introduced during the first Abe administration, which is 2008, but this is a concept that talks about what vision Japan has for the Indo-Pacific region, and that Japan is trying to argue that it would like to promote stability and prosperity of prosperity of the region. And note the map below. It doesn't mean that we only care about California and the west part of the US, but I think there's something to be said about this Pacific Ocean circle that I'd like to point to the first map that I showed you, that Japan looks at the world this way, and Japan thinks that the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean are connected in many ways, and that Japan is at the intersection of the two oceans, and Japan thinks that it should play a role in the region for the wider region to be more safe and prosperous. But let me show you what the Ministry of Defense focus of this is. This is the Ministry of Defense description of the free and open Indo-Pacific. And for that, they are trying to enhance defense cooperations with countries, not just the countries in the blue, which is the US and other Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Europe, and I guess India too, which are the Indo-Pacific countries that you might imagine as to be the developed, or also, I guess, India to be a strong military power, but also Pacific Island countries, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, Middle East, and Africa. But Japan is trying to expand its partnership with countries in the region as a whole. And this is too much detail, but what exactly does that mean? Japan has different types of exchanges in terms of defense cooperation with countries in the region, also to help others have more capacity to ensure maritime security, and to promote initiatives for international peace cooperation activities and incentives for arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. And some examples are on the right, but Japan is not just trying to, one, expand its own defense capacity, two, to maintain and enhance its alliance relationship with the US, but three, to enhance cooperation with countries in the region, especially with Australia and the Philippines, both of which are partners with the US. But I've spoken about half an hour, more than half an hour now, so I would like to wrap up by showing you some slides about what the Japanese public is on this, because I think the impression you might get is that while the Japanese public is realizing that it's in a dangerous part of the world, it seems that Japan has not changed its constitution or its alliance relationship, but it seems like it's really expanding its defense very quickly. And where is the Japanese public on that? If Japan was proud to be a pacifist nation, what do the Japanese public think? And for this, I wrote this essay for Nikkei Asia, but I was really concerned about the rapid speed of things happening and have been turning to some opinion polls to see where the public is. And I'll just show you some slides from part of the opinion polls, but there's two opinion polls I'd like to point to. One is the University of Tokyo Role Survey that was just happened, that's last month in October 2023. And the other is a survey that was jointly done by Japan's Institute for International Affairs and the Chicago Council for Global Affairs on the US-Japan alliance from both countries. But let me just show you some slides that I think are most important from the Role Survey, and share with you some from the other JIIA survey. One, the Japanese public considers the US-Japan relations to be overall good, but I do wonder why there's more people who say neither good or bad than rather good. Maybe there might be some concerns about the nature of the US-Japan relationship, but I think it's more important to note that people are really worried about China and its relationship with China. And at the same time, there is a sense that maybe the US is getting a little bit weaker and China is getting a bit stronger. And for that, maybe there might be some worries about what Japan is doing to keep itself safe. Still, I think there might be a question to you from you that what can Japan do? Can one solution be acquiring its own nuclear weapons? I would like to show you that this actually is very small. And this is in sharp contrast with the public opinion results in the Republic of Korea these days. So I just like to show you this slide to show you that this is not really the choice Japan is doing. And that and about on burden on Okinawa, I said that 70% of US bases is located in Okinawa. About less than half, though, think that it is somewhat inevitable that US military bases are located in Okinawa, but it's not something that people fully agree with. And this is also in terms of what people think about the US-Japan alliance. It doesn't it's I guess it depends on how you read this, but most Japanese people have confidence that the US will come in to the region and help if these type of contingencies happen, but not necessarily. And I think it's how you read the very likely or somewhat likely and how much confidence that gives you. But this is the result that I thought was interesting. And let me just show you the other Chicago Council in Japan Institute for International Affairs poll. This shows you what the Japanese public thinks about the threat to Japan. And this, I think, is the most important that I failed to mention, I should have, when I talked about alliance relationship, that if you put yourself in Japan's shoes, and if you put yourself in Japan's shoes and knows that the US-Japan alliance is set up in the way it is, Japan will always be somewhat worried about abandonment, that the US will not be engaged or follow through on some treaty promises, but it will also be worried about entanglement. The Japan will be entangled into what the US might want to do. So there's always a fear of abandonment versus entanglement. And I think you can say that maybe what Japan has done in recent years is to actually worry more about, or like to be concerned about abandonment, to allow itself to be possibly entangled in more things. That maybe Japan needs to fight along with the US if it wants to keep the arrangement it is. But this is what the public opinion polls say, that whether Japan is more worried about abandonment versus entanglement. And the US distance itself from Japan is abandonment, and Japan gets involved in the conflict between the US and other countries as entanglement. And I think you can still say that people tend to be more worried about entanglement than abandonment. And there's different ways to read that. But I think if you put yourself in Japan's shoes, and given where Japan is, this is something that's interesting to talk about, how and what Japan can do if there's always a balance between abandonment and entanglement. And this is the difference between Japanese and US public opinion on Ukraine issue, and this is on critical threats. I think that this generally shows that the Japanese public and the US public have pretty much converging views on what the critical threats are, but there is a difference in, for instance, Japan on Iran's nuclear program. Japan is not as concerned as the US, but on other issues, I found it actually surprising almost that the American views on critical threats are in line with Japan, given that the US is not as close to the regions that this suggests than Japan. So wrapping up, so I think I try to preempt the common misunderstandings, that is to say that although there has been major changes in Japan's defense posture, and we see headlines say Japan's rearming, Japan's now changing course, I think that it's more important to look at the fact that Article 9 US-Japan alliance, or that's how people call it, actually has not changed. And the main pillars of Japan's security policy has changed with some modifications being reinterpretation of the Constitution to allow for limited collective self-defense, which means that Japan is able to fight with the US in a way that it didn't before, but under limited circumstances. And what is meant by under limited circumstances, I think it's something for discussion. And I did provide some public opinion polls about how the Japanese public thinks about what the limited conditions may be. And I think what's the interesting development since 2021 is that war in Ukraine had more impact than we thought for various reasons. And I think it's fair to say that maybe it's not just in Japan, that I think it was a wake-up call for many countries. But I think it might be the more unlikely one that your students might be interested in, that it had a wake-up call in Japan. And three approaches have not really changed, but it's enhanced Japan's defense capabilities, US-Japan alliance, and collaboration with like-minded countries. And sorry, I really skipped over the collaboration with like-minded countries, but that's not intentional. But it's true that still, I think US-Japan alliance is very fundamental to Japan's defense, but the emphasis right now is on enhancing Japan's defense capabilities, since that's the one that's on top and when we talk about the changes. So the way forward, what does Japanese public opinion tell us, and what would you want if you're Japanese? Given the map that I showed you and the situation that we're in, do you feel less secure? And if you do, what would you do? And I didn't really talk about Mr. Trump as much, but like given the changes in the US, would you feel more secure or less secure in the region, given that Japan's US-Japan alliance is so fundamental to Japan's own defense? Because one thing I didn't elaborate on is that even if Japan enhances Japan's defense capabilities, does that mean that Japan can do defense on its own? The Japanese self-defense force is structured in a way to work alongside the US and not independently. So it doesn't really mean that we have a choice not to be in an alliance. That's not really the point. So what would you want if you're Japanese? But at the same time, as an American, what would you think about the US relationship with Japan? Because I think, as I showed you in alliance, the wording of the alliance, I think it's easy to say that it's unfair. And what would be your response if you're Japanese to claims that it might be unfair? In what ways do you think, or your students might think, that it's somewhat unfair? And I think it's good to have an open discussion about what the perception might be than to not talk about the issue. And that for that reason too, I think an honest discussion is really necessary. And for that, I try to provide what the basis and what the government policy is, rather than my own interpretation of the situation in many ways. So I'll stop there. I think we still have 20 minutes, and I hope there could be some question and answers there.